Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and before we get started on tonight's story, I'm going to let you know about Shudder. Shudder is the best selection of horror, thriller, and supernatural movies, series, and originals, from Hollywood favorites and cult classics to acclaimed new movies you won't find anywhere else. Always streaming uncut and commercial free. And this month till Halloween, Shudder will be celebrating their largest lineup of new shows and titles for their Home for Halloween celebration. Now through October 31st, sink your teeth into Shudder's biggest slate of must-see originals and new movies. Get in on all the scares with Shudder's expertly curated collection, including must-see titles like 101 Scariest Horror Movie Moments of All Time, Queer for Fear, The History of Queer Horror, VHS 94, Deadstream, Dark Glasses, plus a new series from Bullet Brothers spin-off series. And I really have to recommend Deadstream. A lot of my friends have been talking about it. They've been telling me to watch it, and I have to recommend it to you guys. A disgraced and demonetized internet personality tries to win back his fans by live streaming himself spending a night alone in an abandoned haunted house. However, when he accidentally unleashes a vengeful spirit, his big comeback event becomes a real-time fight for his life and for social relevance. As he faces off with the sinister spirit of the house and her powerful following. Deadstream stars Joseph Winter, who wrote and directed the film with Vanessa Winter, and it is a Shudder original. It is hilarious, it is really fun, and I mean, hey, it hits close to home. So try Shudder for free for 30 days, and go over to Shudder.com and use promo code CreepyPasta, that's all one word, and that's Shudder, SHUDDER.com, and the promo code CreepyPasta, just like you see on your screen. I have to thank Shudder so much for helping me out on this month, which is probably the most difficult October we've had to deal with. So a huge thank you to Shudder. I'd really love for you guys to give them a chance. And now, on to tonight's story. Jacob Masterson was dreaming of a man, an executioner plagued by the devil. In his left hand, he held a hell-bound blade that burned with eternal fire. In his right, an endless stream of blood poured forth, turning into molten lava as it hit the scorched and blackened earth. Then I saw an angel, he said, turning to face Jacob. Sitting in the sun, with a loud voice, he called to all the birds of mid-heaven, "Come and gather for the great supper of God, to eat the flesh of kings and captains, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses and their riders. For he has set his mark upon them, the mark of the beast. And they who bear the mark shall cast down, and the birds will gorge upon their ruined flesh." Suddenly the man's mouth shot open, stretching impossibly wide, eating up his face as a mass of ravens issued forth, hundreds, thousands. They screeched as they flew at Jacob, tearing at his face, gouging out his eyes. Jacob stirred in his sleep as one dream gave way to another. Now he was standing in a mist-shrouded graveyard, a skeletal tree growing from the blasted earth, crawling with maggots and all manner of squirming things. Overhead, ravens circled, mocking him with their caw-like laughter. Jacob looked down at the open grave before him. The tombstone read, "Jane Mary Masterson, beloved wife of Jacob, gone down into dark waters." A rotting hand caressed his shoulder, the smell of decay suffocating him. "Come home, my beloved," she crooned, her cold breath caressing his cheek. "Come home, Jacob, for the dead do not rest." Suddenly, she pushed him into the very grave she had crawled out of. He began to scream, dirt filling his mouth as he was buried alive by an army of dead. With a cry, Jacob awoke, his feet thrashing in the dirt as he scrambled away from the remains of his dying campfire, breathing hard, his hand hovering close to his revolver. Taking a long, shuddering breath, he looked out at the sky with one good eye before leaning heavily against a nearby rock, the sound of the ocean calming his torn and battered nerves. "Goddamn dreams," he growled, wiping the sweat from his brow and letting up a smoke. It would be light soon, and he could continue the last leg of his journey, back to Shoresvale, finally back home, after all these years. He wondered if the old place had changed much, and what was afoot there. Jacob had been having the same dream on and off for more than a month now, his long-dead wife calling to him from the cold iron earth. "Jane," he whispered her name, conjuring up a vision of her. That flowing corn-silk hair and eyes as blue and deep as the ocean. Even after all these years, he could still recall the sound of her laughter and the way her lips tilted when she smiled at him. Jacob had only ever loved one woman, and now, for some reason, it seemed she was haunting his dreams and calling him back home. Or perhaps something masquerading as her. If that was the case, then whatever this thing was, it would pay a high price for its deception. Sighing, Jacob stoked up the fire and laid on a pot of coffee just as the first rays of dawn started to stain the night sky. "Blessed is the man whose patience exceeds his temperament," Jacob muttered. His words were carried on the night air and cast into the wind. Later that day, Jacob found himself in the lush forests of New England. By his reckoning, he was perhaps only 10 miles from home. He'd grown up in Shoresvale, the only son of a preacher. His mother had died, bringing him into the world. His father had tried his best not to hold it against him. Still, he never seemed to have much time for his wild-eyed son, except to administer a whooping when Jacob found himself in trouble, which was often. As a youth, Jacob had been prone to mischief. Whether this was a cry for attention or just his restless nature, nobody could tell. But if there was ever an incident in the small coastal town, you could bet a silver dollar Jacob Masterson was involved. The other children lived in fear of his quick temper and hard fists, but when Jane's family moved into the town, and Jacob saw her for the first time, it was as if he had been struck by lightning. Jacob's father used to rattle on about angels, and Jacob was never too sure if they existed or not, but after seeing Jane for the first time, he became a believer. Nobody could be that graceful and beautiful without somehow being touched by God. Jacob, who by then had turned into a tall, gangly teen, had gone out of his way to bump into Jane whenever he could, and they had soon struck up an unlikely friendship. The townsfolk had looked on with awe as Jacob's temper first cooled, then evaporated, as if Jane was a damp cloth upon a fevered brow. It was Jane who had convinced Jacob to follow in his father's footsteps and to give back to the community he had once so badly terrorized, and Jacob, wanting to be a better man for her, had done just that. A few years later, they were married, and Jacob filled the role of the town's preacher shortly after his father's passing. Their lives had been quiet in the dreamy New England town, and they had started to talk about having children and starting a family of their own. But that was before hell had come to their little town. Jacob had been in the pantry, taking stock of the winter supplies, when he had heard Jane scream. A tin of canned goods had slipped through his fingers as the scream was repeated, and then suddenly cut short. Leaping from the stool, Jacob had crashed through the door and out into the yard where Jane had been gathering her drying sheets. It was almost full dark, but Jacob easily picked out Jane's crumpled form. Jacob let out a cry and ran to her, falling to his knees, gathering her up, looking in disbelief at her clawed and bloody face, and what was left of her torn throat. That same throat he had kissed 1,000 times. "Jane!" he cried, shaking her roughly, already knowing she was dead but unable or unwilling to accept it. "For the love of God, Jane, please, please wake up!" But she only lay there, her glassy eyes reflecting the emerging moon. They found him there the next day, silent tears streaming down his face, clutching her poor broken body tightly. They had tried to take her from him, but he had fought them like a wild man until at last the sheriff had bushwhacked him from behind with the butt of his revolver. He had awoken in a cell ranting and raving. There he stayed for the next 10 days until a kind of icy calmness fell over him, and he convinced them that his fit of madness had passed. He was released with their verdict of an animal attack ringing in his ears. Although what kind of animal it was, no one could say. Jacob had gone back to his church and fallen before the altar, praying furiously for some kind of answer and a way to make sense of it all. But when no answers had been forthcoming, he had flown into a rage, tearing at the altar, sending hot wax flying. He had grabbed up the large wooden cross, smashing it into so many kindling, before collapsing in a dead faint. his exhaustion and heartbreak overcoming him. It was in this moment of utmost despair that God had finally spoken to him, not with words, but with a multitude of images. The first thing he saw was Woodsville, an abandoned town a little way down the coast. The second was a graveyard, covered with the headstones of dead children. Something moved through the darkness, shrouded by a creeping mist that seems to crawl and undulate with a life of its own. It dwelled in the mist, a presence that gloated and fed on fear, pain, and blood. Jacob awoke in the ruins of his own sin and uttered a single word. Vampire. Jacob spent the rest of the night cleaning up the church, all the while begging God for forgiveness and his aid in the coming days. In the long years ahead, he would come to wonder if such an apology was warranted, and if God had sacrificed Jane to rouse Jacob's wrath and make him an instrument of his own vengeance. But such thoughts were way into the future, and, for now, there was no doubt in Jacob's mind, just a burning need for blood and retribution against the thing that had torn his life apart. When the daybreak finally came, Jacob was ready. Filling an old water skin with holy water from the font, a silver crucifix about his neck, he saddled his horse and rode into town. Many people saw Jacob that day and gave him a wide berth as he strode up the stairs and into the gunsmith. The man behind the counter licked his lips nervously as Jacob approached. "Reverend," he stuttered, "I was mightily sorry to hear about your Jane." "Stop flapping your mouth," Jacob snarled, slamming a wad of full bills on the counter. "Gonna need some pistols. You mean the best ones you got?" Yes, sir." The other man jumped to it, quickly opening up the gun case before popping back up like a jack-in-the-box. "These are Colt Pattersons, Reverend. 36 caliber 5-shot. Even the Texas Rangers prefer this model. Many a Comanche fallen by the wayside to a good Patterson." "And you think that's a good thing?" Jacob said, hefting the revolvers, liking the feel of them in his hands. The man didn't quite know how to answer that, so wisely kept his mouth shut. Jacob picked out a gun belt that hung low on his slender hip. "May as well give me the double barrel, too, and a whole mess of cartridges." "You plan on some kind of hunting trip, Reverend?" The other man finally got up the courage to ask, deathly afraid Jacob had lost his mind and, in his anguish and grief, was perhaps planning on shooting up the entire town. "Yeah," Jacob grinned a grin that made the other fella feel sick to his guts. "That's damn right. A hunting trip." That said, Jacob stomped away carrying a small arsenal, and that same sickly grin stamped across his rough features. As soon as Jacob left, the gunsmith ran across the street into the sheriff's office. Jacob was halfway to Woodsville when the sheriff caught up to him along the coast road. "Afternoon, Reverend," he said, pulling his horse up in front of Jacob, who had to pull harshly on the reins to head off a collision. "The hell do you think you're doing, Finley?" he spat. "You trying to send us both tumbling in the goddamn ocean?" "It's harsh words for a man of God," the sheriff replied, patting the side of the big mare's neck. "Then maybe you mind telling me we're off to in such a damn hurry with those revolvers strapped to your hip?" "And what if I ain't in the frame of mind about telling you such a thing?" Jacob replied. "Well, then I guess I'll be taking you back to town," Finley said, shifting uncomfortably in his saddle. "That ain't gonna happen. Not without blood being spilled on this here road." "No need for such talk. The hell's gotten into you, Jacob? You're a man of God, for Christ's sake. Not some gunslinger or a hired killer." "That man's gone," Jacob spat into the dirt. "The thing that killed my Jane's out here in Woodsville." "Woodsville's been abandoned for close to 5 years now. I had a pestilence. Sweat and sickness had killed off most of the population. You know that, Jacob." "Yeah," Jacob replied. "That's what I thought I knew. God showed me different. There's a creature that killed these people, spread a disease amongst them with its bite. The same bastard thing that killed my Jane. And I have a feeling it means to take our town next. And I ain't about to let that happen." The sheriff sighed, knowing it would do no good to try and talk Jacob out of his delusion, so he decided to play along. Figuring if Jacob went to the old town and saw nothing was amiss, he may accept some help and come back without too much fussing. All right, then. Let's say what you're saying's true. You want to go up there against this thing, whatever it is, alone? He asked. Or do you think a little help could be called for? It's my town too, Jacob. Hell, I'm the sheriff, ain't I? Jacob thought about it for a moment. Yeah, I guess you are. And you're welcome to come along. Free country, after all. I have a feeling you're humoring me all the same. If you are, you can humor me a little more and put this on, he said, reaching into his pocket and throwing something to the sheriff. He caught it up in midair. It was a crucifix. Slipping it over his neck, he followed on behind Jacob, wondering what the hell he was getting himself into. They were on the outskirts of town when the two men spoke again. So this thing, Finley said, this creature that God showed you, what is it exactly? Reckon some kind of vampire, Jacob replied. But not in those old books and fairy tales. This thing doesn't just drink blood, it also spreads fear and disease. And you think it was this thing that killed the townsfolk? The sheriff said, dismounting and tying up his horse close to Jacob's. Yeah, Jacob said, flinging his shotgun behind his back. I do. And how do we kill it? Jacob stood stock still, remembering the old folklore. Well, they say crosses and other holy objects will drive it off, burn its hide. With a stake through the heart or decapitation should finish it off. You can cut the head off anything and it'll lay still, I guess. Okay then, the sheriff said, leading the way. If we see anyone up in that old place, you keep your guns holstered unless they make some kind of play, and let me do the talking. Sure, Jacob said, but his hands had already drifted down towards his guns. Woodsville itself had once been a thriving town situated on the coast. The people had made their living from the ocean by selling and salting fish, also from logging the nearby forest. Up until 5 years ago, the town had been flourishing and expanding, but that was before the pestilence had come, wiping out the entire colony and causing the survivors to flee to whatever nearby towns and villages would have them. There had been some talk of a flame-eyed monster that stalked the night, but the days of believing in such things were well behind the folks in New England, who viewed their ancestors as superstitious fools and religious zealots, who would cry witch at the drop of a hat. And so these stories were discarded and written off as grief and madness in the wake of such a terrible tragedy. But now, Jacob knew better. Hadn't God himself shown him the truth of things? Hadn't Jane paid the price of people's disbelief in the things that stayed hidden in the dark corners of the world and reveled in men's pain and misery? Sure is a hell of a spooky place, the sheriff said, taking in the deserted building all around them as they made their way up the main street. Look there, Jacob said, heading towards the general store. That bolt of cloth must be worth $20, he said, peering through the window before trying the door and pushing his way inside. Oh, would you look at that, the sheriff said, following on behind. Entire store's still stocked. Whoever left here, they left in a hurry. Jacob said nothing, taking in the canned goods that still stocked the dusty shelves before heading over to a pile of farming tools, grabbing up a wicked-looking sickle, pleased to see its dusty edge was still firm and sharp. Meanwhile, the sheriff headed over to the cobweb-strewn counter and rung up the till, which popped open, revealing a few silver dollars within. Can't believe this stuff hadn't been touched. Not many people willing to walk in a plague town, Jacob said, heading outside, glad for the fresh air. Wonder if the saloon's the same. Could use a stiff drink. Jacob didn't want to admit it, but the place had him on edge. There was a feeling in the air, a kind of anticipation of dreadful things still to come. If the sheriff felt the same, he didn't show it. Both men entered the saloon at the same time, pushing through the creaking bat-wing doors. If anything, the saloon was in even better condition. The bar was filled with dust-covered bottles. Even the piano was still intact where it sat in the corner like a forgotten relic. A hand of blackjack lay face up on a nearby table. Jacob, wasted no time and went behind the bar. Blowing the dust from a couple of shot glasses, he poured them both a shot of whiskey. "So what now, Jacob?" Finley asked. "I don't see any sign of the creature you mentioned, just an old town starting to rot. A lot of people left in a damn hurry to avoid whatever disease is trying to kill them." Jacob nodded his agreement. "Sure looks that way, but God showed me another place. Old boneyard up the hill. Reckon we should check that place next." "And if there still ain't nothing?" Finley asked, throwing back the dreg of his drink. "Then I intend to wait around until nightfall and see what happens." "You're welcome to leave at any time," Jacob said sourly. "Think I'll stick around some," the sheriff said, grabbing up his hat. "Let's go take a look at this graveyard of yours." The Woodsville Cemetery sat atop a small flat hill in the western side of town. It was shaped like an upside-down horseshoe and surrounded by tall trees, their leaves just starting to pick up a hint of red as summer gave way to fall. Most of the graves were marked with nothing more than a simple wooden cross hastily erected and hammered into the ground, the names of loved ones carved into the wood, but every now and again, a stone angel reared around these paupers' graves, as if patiently awaiting the day of judgment. The whole place was silent. There was no trilling birdsong, no chirping of crickets in the long grass. Nothing. Just an eerie, waiting silence. "Quiet, ain't it?" Jacob said, licking his lips nervously. The sheriff said nothing, but his hands had dropped to the pistol by his side, and his eyes scanned the lengthening shadows. "Well, we ain't gonna see much stood up here chewing the breeze," Jacob said, leading the way. "You go left, I'll go right. Cover more ground that way." "What are we looking for?" the sheriff replied. Jacob shrugged. "Not rightly sure. Let's get to looking anyway." It was less than 5 minutes later when Jacob heard a squawk of surprise, followed by a scream of pain. Drawing his revolver, Jacob came on the run, calling the sheriff's name. "Careful!" the sheriff screamed as Jacob skidded to a halt. There was a massive hole before him, the smell driving him backwards. It was a smell of rot and decay, of fly-blown maggots. Jacob could almost feel it sliming the back of his throat. As he edged closer to the shallow grave, "Get me out, Jacob!" the sheriff pleaded and looked up at him. "For the love of God, please get me out!" "Jesus Christ," Jacob said, making the sign of the cross. The grave was filled with bodies of children in various states of decay. The whole thing seemed to be moving, undulating, and Jacob realized to his horror, the pit was filled with swarming maggots. "Please!" the sheriff begged, his hand stretched towards Jacob. "Get me out of this!" Jacob wasted no time and laid on his stomach, ignoring the smell as best he could. He grabbed hold of the sheriff's hand and hauled him out, both men collapsing in the dirt. Immediately, the sheriff shot to his feet and tore at his slime-covered clothes, vomiting and cursing until at last he stood there in his drawers. "Their hands are tied," he finally croaked. "Their hands and feet are tied, as if someone was scared they'd get back up. And why are they all together that way?" "'Cause someone dug them up and threw them there," Jacob replied, clambering to his feet. "I found disturbed and empty graves all over the place. Look," Jacob said, pointing a blunt finger to his left. "And there," he said, shifting to his right. "All these graves have been disturbed in one fashion or another. This is a sacrilege, and them all being innocent children and all. Someone or something is spitting in the eye of God." "Whatever it is, I ain't sticking around to find out," Finley said, gathering up his gun belt band and kicking at his clothes. "I'm heading back to town, getting the hell out of here. Reckon you should do the same, Jacob. We can call the marshal's office when we get back and report this desecration." "You go on," Jacob said, heading back down the hill, the sheriff limping by his side. "I don't hold it against you. Besides, look like that fall busted you up some. Do me a favor before you go," he said, putting some distance between them. "Get yourselves cleaned up. Find some goddamn clothes. You stink like a dead polecat." "Well, excuse me," the sheriff huffed before storming away. Now Jacob sat alone in the saloon, his back against the wall, revolvers on the table before him. He checked his pocket watch. It was 1 a.m. in the morning. If whatever was haunting this town didn't come for him soon, he'd have to go out and search for the damn thing. The thought of walking around in this dead, haunted town gave him the shudders as he sat tight, smoking cigarette after cigarette, his lined face lit by the glow of a nearby oil lamp. He didn't have to wait long. It was as if his very thought had summoned the creature as it slunk through the batwing doors, grinning at Jacob through a mouthful of fanged teeth. The remains of an ancient-looking suit clinging to its gaunt, skinny frame. "Well, well, well," he laughed. "And what do we have here? Usually I have to go out to eat, but tonight the prey comes to me." Jacob straightened and grabbed for his revolvers. The creature halted but did not retreat, sniffing at the air. "Lead," it grinned. "Painful, yes, but far from fatal. Is that all you've brought to destroy such as me?" "And what the hell are you?" Jacob snarled. "It wants a conversation." The creature chuckled. "Very well. I shall indulge you before I drink your life's blood. I am Morio Vicoricos. In the West, they call us vampire. There was no place for me among my own kind, not in the old world, but here, in the fresh land. I'm free from their hate and oppression." "Hated by your own kind?" Jacob said, trying to buy time, his mind racing. "Oh yes," the creature growled, slowly edging forward. "I was diseased when I was bitten. I should never have survived. But I did. Now my bite brings only death and pestilence. No immortality for my victims, only the cold earth." It chuckled. Suddenly it lunged forward, but Jacob shot to his feet, grabbing up his revolvers and kicking the table over, causing the creature to trip. It howled in pain as Jacob unloaded into its back and head, but the thing almost instantaneously began to heal as it caught up to Jacob's foot and sent him crashing backwards. It was dragging itself up his body now, its shattered skull reforming at the touch of its vile cold flesh. Jacob began to shudder, but he lay still, his hands at his throat. The creature grinned, revealing teeth grown impossibly long. "I'm going to drink you slow. For days you will last," it said, rearing above him, ready to strike. Jacob removed his hands as if accepting his fate, and the creature struck with blind hunger. Jacob waited until he felt its cold lips against his throat, then rammed the silver crucifix he had torn from his neck to the side of its face. There was a blue flash, and it reared back, howling in pain, the side of its face smoking. Jacob scrambled backwards. "Bastard thing!" he cried, meaning to thrust the now glowing cross through the creature's forehead, but it stumbled away as if half-blinded, giving Jacob the opportunity he needed. Grabbing the water skin from around his back, he doused the creature in holy water, burning its vile flesh as it fled into the night. Even wounded and half-blind, he was fast. But Jacob was young and strong, full of hate, and he pursued it relentlessly up to the old graveyard. There it dived into the pit and burrowed down amongst the old, poor, rotting, dead children, and was soon gone from sight. Jacob nodded knowingly and marched away. He spent the rest of what was left of the night gathering up every oil lamp he could find, knowing the creature was too badly injured to do him any more harm. With the rising sun, he stood above the grave, smashed and emptied oil lamps all around him. "They say that fire purifies. But fuck that." And he grinned, striking a match. "I say it only destroys." That said, he cast the match into the grave. For a second, nothing happened. Then the whole thing went up like a tar barrel with a great whoosh and tower of flames. From inside the grave, something began to scream and howl in pain. Seconds later, the vampire crawled over the edge of the grave, its skin blackened and burned. It stared at Jacob as if marking him forever, before the weak rays of the rising sun finished the fire's dreadful work. Jacob pulled out his maypole and pissed on the ashes before riding away. He never did return home. That must have been close to 20 years ago. And now he was finally coming back. The landmarks and the forest looked more and more familiar to him until at last he came to a wide open field, not more than 5 miles outside of town. Here he found a sea of tents, small campfires smoldering from the night before and people busying themselves with their morning chores. Jacob rode into this makeshift town, slowly concealing his revolvers under his long coat, not wanting to frighten these uprooted townsfolk any further. But even so, he was soon noticed and approached by a tall, slender man with graying hair and a rather large, bushy handlebar mustache. "Howdy, stranger," the man said, his eyes searching Jacob's hands, one hand on his hip close to his pistol, the other he put flat against the big mare's neck, patting it fondly. "Afraid we ain't got nothing for you here, stranger. And there been some bad trouble around these parts. Think it's, best if you move right along." "You still playing it, Sheriff?" Jacob grinned down at him. For a moment, the man seemed confused, but then his weathered face broke into a sunny grin. Jacob Masterson, is that you?" "Reckon so," Jacob grinned back, sliding off his horse. "We thought you dead. There was fire up the old town. Whole place burned flat." "Good." Jacob spat in the mud. A few people had gathered around now to see what the commotion was about. Some faces Jacob recognized, some he didn't. After all, 20 years was a long time. A woman came forward now. She was tall and pretty, missing beauty by only a bare inch. She looked Jacob up and down before slapping him hard across the face. The crowd let out a murmur and backed up a little. "So you come back here, have you, after all this time? Not in close to 20 years. You bother to tend your wife's grave or pay your respects to my poor murdered cousin? You have some damn nerve showing your face around here, Jacob Masterson."
"Anna, listen,"
Jacob began, but didn't know really where to go from there. "Like there ain't been enough trouble around here already," she said, great tears standing out in her eyes.
"Now listen up, Anna," Finley began. "Jacob here is a preacher. Perhaps God sent him to lift his curse he's seen fit to put upon us."
"You hush your mouth," she said to him, cutting at him with her flashing blue eyes. The sheriff clammed up quickly as she turned back to Jacob. "We don't need you here, Masterson. And if you finally come to do right by Jane, I wouldn't recommend riding into town." With that hanging between them, she stormed away, leaving Jacob hurt and embarrassed.
"Come on, Jacob," Finley said, leading Jacob away. "I have a bottle in my tent and could use some drinking. You can tell me about where you've been, things you've seen."
A little while later, both men were seated comfortably in Finley's tent, a small campfire smoldering outside to keep the autumn chill at bay.
"What's going on here, Finley?"
Jacob asked, ignoring the man's many questions.
"Why you folks camped out here and not in town?"
The sheriff took a hard pull from his bottle before offering it to Jacob, who refused.
"I don't think you believe me if I told you."
The sheriff laughed, a hint of hysteria in his voice.
"Try me. You'd be surprised by the things I've seen."
Finley nodded, looking at Jacob's scarred and battered face.
"Where'd you lose your eye?"
he asked.
"Why don't you stop avoiding the questions and start talking?"
Jacob replied. The sheriff nodded, not sure if he liked this new version of the man he had once known. Jacob seemed harder now and somewhat colder, as if the world had broken him and reforged him into something else.
"All right,"
he said, taking another drink. His voice was starting to slur now. Jacob reached over, ignoring the other man's protests, as he plucked the bottle from his fingers and placed it by his side.
"Talk. You can drink yourself into a stupor on another man's time." "Well, okay, goddammit. You want the truth? Here we go. The dead are walking in Shoresvale. How do you like that? The dead themselves clawed their way out of their very own graves. Just started murdering people."
Jacob suddenly heard a voice in his head. "Come home, Jacob, for the dead do not rest."
"When did this all start?"
Jacob asked.
"You mean you believe me?"
the sheriff said incredulously.
"Yeah, I believe you. Now tell me everything." "It started with dreams. People in town all began to have the same dream. A dark figure shrouded in shadows, chanting in the darkness, calling someone forth. Something for it. Flash of a blade, the screams of the tormented and the damned. Soon after, the crops began to die, and a massive dead fish washed up on the shore with them. Then came the flies, hundreds, thousands of them, laying their eggs everywhere. Our pantries were crawling with maggots. Soon after, the graveyard gave up its dead all in one night. Massive, rotting corpses, grabbing people up off the street, carrying them away. They were unstoppable, unkillable. And any who tried had their throats torn open and their flesh devoured. It was chaos, anarchy. We fled, set up camp here. Hell, where else did we have to go? How long ago was this? A few weeks ago. And they replied, some people who tried to go back, they never returned. So, what have you done about any of this? Done? The other man laughed. What do you expect me to do, Jacob? We're cut off from anywhere. Nearest town you burned down years ago. Nobody ever rebuilt it. And who would believe such an outrageous story? So you just been sat here? What, just waiting for the whole thing to blow over? Jacob said angrily. Look, Jacob, the nearest town is over 100 miles away. One that would have a telegraph anyway. Some have already left, but winter's coming on fast. You know damn well what winter is like in these parts. And you expect to survive it out here? Jacob said, raising to his feet, knowing the man was lost, too wrapped up in his own self-pity and grief. Where's Anna's tent? He said, giving him back his bottle. Finley told him. And Jacob left. Anna's tent was in a cold, damp glade at the rear of the camp. Jacob approached quietly, sticking to the tree line, watching her as she pegged out clothes on a makeshift washing line. When he had last seen her, she had been a pretty young woman with a flashing smile. Now, like himself, she was older, but just as pretty, with the same corn silk hair and blue eyes that so reminded him of her cousin Jane. The only difference was Jane had always been kind of quiet and shy, unlike Anna, who had always had a quick temper behind that coy smile of hers. Coughing nervously, Jacob stepped out into view. Anna took one look at him and her eyes narrowed, her brow furrowing. I thought I told you to get out of here, Jacob. Yeah, you did, Jacob said, whipping his hat from his head and crushing it to his chest. But I think I'll stay just the same. I think the town needs me right now. The sheriff told me everything that's happened. That man is a drunken fool, she snapped. I won't argue that one, but still reckon there's a little strength left inside him yet. Oh, he's so forgiving. She turned on him, her hands on her hips. Still playing the holy man, Jacob? I ain't playing at nothing, Jacob snapped back at her. I spent the last 20 years doing God's will, whether I liked it or not. If you only knew the things I'd seen, the things I've done, Anna. What have you done, Jacob? She replied, her voice softening somewhat at the sound of the anguish in his voice. I kill, Anna. Killed things like the creatures now haunting your town. I spent the better part of my youth hunting them down and destroying them in the name of God. If I hadn't seen the things I'd seen recently, I'd say you'd lost your mind somewhere out there on the trail, she said. But I saw them, Jacob. The dead walking in the streets. Even my own mother and father. She started to sob now. The last of her defiance breached as she fell to her knees, her skirt hiding her face. Jacob went to her, then fell before her, taking her in his embrace. At first she fought him, slapping at his face, but Jacob withstood it, until at last she sagged in his arms and wept hopelessly into his shoulder. All the time Jacob crooned at her softly and stroked her hair. After a little while, her sobbing turned to sniffling, and she gently pushed him away and climbed to her feet. Well, I guess you can stay for supper, Jacob Masterson, she said haughtily before quickly turning away and heading for her tent. That's some woman, Jacob grinned before following after her, careful to wipe the mud from his boots before he stepped inside. Supper consisted of a rabbit stew,
heavy with vegetables and thick gravy. Jacob ate 2 bowls and nearly a full basket of biscuits. Good to see a man with a good appetite. Anna laughed. Jacob burped guiltily and put down his spoon.
Been a long time since I ate a home-cooked meal. Mainly had tack and jerky on the range. And you're a damn fine cook, if I may say so.
You may, she smiled, happy with the compliment. My husband Sam used to say so. There she tapered off, looking down into her half-finished meal.
Your husband passed,
Jacob said, lighting up a smoke. Yes, she snapped at him. And don't you be getting your cigarette ash on my good tablecloth.
Yes, ma'am,
Jacob said, flicking his ash outside the tent's entrance.
Was it recent?
She nodded. I saw it happen. He died fighting those things so I could get away. They tore him apart in the middle of the street. She wiped at her eyes irritably.
I'm sorry, Anna,
Jacob said, reaching for her hand, but she withdrew, looking at him angrily. So, what do you intend to do about all this, Jacob Masterson? She asked. You said that you have fought these kinds of things before, and I'm willing to take your word for it. You've always been many things, Jacob. Not all of them good. But you ain't never been no liar. Besides, I seen those scars you have on your body as you washed up for supper.
You spying on me?
Jacob joked gently. Well, it's a small damn tent, ain't it? She replied, her eyes flashing.
Okay, settle down.
Jacob tried not to grin.
You're right, of course. Something must be done.
He told her then of the dream that he'd been having on and off over the past few weeks. She mulled over his words for quite some time before looking back at him. Under normal circumstances, I would say it was your own guilty conscience plaguing you for deserting your flock and leaving poor Jane's grave so unattended. Although I visited often after you left. Now you say that she's called you back. Jacob nodded solemnly. Then you better get back to town and see what's going on up there. You can spend the night here on the floor, mind you, she said quickly. I got a spare blanket or 2, and in the morning, you can ride out.
Thank you, Anna,
Jacob said. She waved that away. Now go get some more water from the creek. There's an old wash tub at the back of the tent. You still smell like a mule, Jacob Masterson. Jacob got up, sighed, and went to fetch a bucket, not really minding at all. In the morning, he awoke early. Anna made him some coffee and eggs, all cooked over the campfire. After they finished eating, Jacob helped her clean up before wishing her a fond farewell and heading back towards the sheriff's tent. He only turned back once to find her still stood there watching him. She stood like that for some time, watching until he passed out of sight, before retreating back inside. Jacob had expected to find the sheriff in a drunken stupor, but the man was up and about, clean-shaven and dressed.
Are you ready?
He said, strapping on his guns.
Ready for what exactly?
Jacob said.
To ride into town, Finley said. That's where you're going, ain't you? I'm coming with you. The hell you are!
No, was that you tried to say to me all those years ago when I tried to stop you, going off half-cocked on your own? Something about blood being spilt if I tried to stop you.
Well, now it's the same. If you want to stop me from coming, you have to shoot me, Jacob. It's free country after all. I'm the goddamn sheriff. Well, you're saying I'm a good one. You know, I made mistakes, scared witless. I ain't gonna lie about that, but I mean to come with you all the same. See this thing through.
Jacob weighed the man's words.
Tell me, the old Stapleton farm still outside of town? He asked.
The hell's that got to do with anything? Finley replied hotly.
Just answer the goddamn question.
Yeah, it's still there. Run by his 2 sons, old Stapleton passed a few summers back.
Still got that old sword of his hanging on the wall? The one his father brought over from England.
Last time I visited the boys a few months back, it was there hanging over the fireplace as usual.
Well, that's just grand, Jacob said. Let's saddle up and ride.
The two men rode in silence until the Stapleton ranch came into view. There, Jacob pulled up the big mare and turned to the sheriff.
I fought these things before, Finley. They ain't easy to kill. Only sure way to kill them is to take off their heads. Gunfire will slow them down if you take them out at the knee. The sons of bitches will crawl after you. So you take this, he said, drawing the double barrel from under his saddlebag and tossing it over. If any of those things are inside, you give them both barrels, either to the face or the knee. You understand me, Sheriff?
Sure, I understand, but what about you?
Me?
Jacob grinned.
I got God on my side.
Together they rode down towards the waiting ranch. The ranch itself was a one-story affair, long and wooden with a large porch surrounded by barns, silos, and outbuildings. A few pigs lay dead and stinking in the nearby pen. Others had smashed their way through out of hunger and desperation and took to the hills.
Well, Finley said nervously, looks like the old place has gone to hell since I was last here.
Yeah, Jacob said, pulling out his revolver.
Sure looks that way. Come on, let's go take a look inside.
They were just entering the porch when a low groan came from behind them. Jacob spun about, almost knocking the sheriff over, who had been standing close behind him.
Son of a bitch,
Finley cursed.
That's old man Stapleton.
The corpse was shambling towards them now, worms in its hair, leaving squirming parts of itself behind as it came on, a wicked-looking sickle clasped in its dirt-boned hand. Only its eyes truly looked alive, where it glared at them from the deep recesses of its skull-like face. Jacob was just about to raise his pistol when the window shattered behind him, and a pair of torn and tattered arms dragged him backwards, screaming as he went. The broken glass raked at his legs, cutting easily through his worn jeans and the flesh beneath. From outside came the deafening roar of a shotgun. But Jacob had concerns of his own. As the arms tightened around him, a wet, stinking mouth clamped down, tearing at his shoulder. Bellowing in pain, Jacob raised his legs, kicked against the wall, sending himself and the creature crashing into the rear wall with numbing force. The vibration slackened the creature's grip only for an instant, but that was all Jacob needed. Using that same uncanny quickness that had saved his life so many times, he slid down and out of the creature's grip, leaving a goodish amount of flesh behind, which the creature swallowed greedily. Without turning, Jacob fled through the door, out of the bedroom and into the hall, heading for the front of the house. Another creature lurched at him as he entered the sitting room, but Jacob easily dodged its feeble attempts and raced over to the mantelpiece. The sword was still there, ancient and slightly curved. He grabbed it up and tore it from the scabbard, just as the creature reached for him. With a cry, he backed up and swung the sword. It sheared through the creature's neck like a hot knife through butter, decapitating the shambling horror in one fell swoop. The other brother was coming down the hall towards him, its mouth stained red with Jacob's blood.
"Bastard thing!"
Jacob said, swinging the sword downwards, cleaving the thing's head in two. It fell to its knees, but still reached for him, grasping, twisting hands until Jacob took the head, and at last it lay still. Another shotgun blast came from the yard, and Jacob stumbled through the door, calling the sheriff's name. "Over here!" Finley cried from the side of the barn. Jacob ran over.
"Kill the fucking thing," Finley said, breathless. "Shot its legs, just like you said. Gave it both barrels to the face. Blew its head clean off. Jesus, Jacob, you're bleeding all over the place." "Nothing too serious,"
Jacob said, wadding the bandage and stuffing it inside his shirt over the bite in his shoulder and picking a few pieces of glass from the shallow cuts in his legs.
"You best take the sickle with you. Come on, let's ride into town and finish this thing."
They entered the town with the midday sun at their backs. Everywhere, there were signs of a titanic struggle. Some of the houses and stores had been burned to the ground, and the streets were awash with pieces of torn, bloody flesh and half-eaten corpses. Flies buzzed all around them, and the whole place smelled of carrion and rotten flesh.
"How did this happen?" Finley gasped. "I mean, how is it even possible, Jacob?" "Powerful witch, maybe," Jacob replied, his eyes watchful. "Saw something like this a couple months back. Nothing to this degree, but similar all the same. Whatever it is, whoever it is, we need to stop it now, today."
"But why?" Finley asked.
"Why would anyone want to do this?"
But Jacob only shook his head sadly.
"Why does anyone do anything? Let's just find it and stop this madness. Where do you want to start?"
the sheriff asked.
Guess we better take turns around town. The streets seem pretty quiet. Undead aren't overly fond of the sunlight. They could be anywhere. Hell, they could be watching us right now.
Yeah, Finley replied. Let me just go over to the sheriff's office first. I got 2 whole boxes of shells for this thing, he said, hefting the shotgun, and a spare for your good self, just in case you get tired of swinging that old sword.
Not fucking likely,
Jacob retorted.
With the more firepower, the better.
It's just up the street, Finley said, pointing.
Yeah, I see it,
Jacob said, his eyes restless.
You go on. I'll sit right here, watch your back. But hurry the hell up. This place is all manners are wrong.
Sure, the sheriff replied and quickly hurried away. As soon as Finley entered the building, a voice floated out of the shadow of a nearby barn. Jacob turned towards the voice, his eyes wide, his mouth trembling. From behind him came a scream of anguish, but Jacob barely noticed it. He knew that voice. It was the voice of Jane, as soft and as pure as freshly fallen snow. Jacob dismounted and, almost trance-like, walked towards the barn, his dead wife's name falling from his lips.
Jane,
he said, entering the gloom.
Jane, where are you? I come just like you said.
Let me give you peace, Jacob, the voice whispered. Outside. Now. Turning, Jacob fled back outdoors. He could see her now, a distant figure beckoning to him from the far-off tree line.
Jane!
He screamed, running towards her. But she turned and fled as he drew closer. He burst from the tree line and into an open field, a church in the near distance. He realized where she was headed. She was taking him home. Jacob walked towards the church, his church, where it all began. There was no need to hurry now. He knew Jane would be waiting for him inside. Slowly, he mounted the steps and pushed his way inside, his wife's name falling from his lips like a desperate prayer, his trance-like state breaking as he looked on in horror at the carnage within. The church was full of dead, some still animated, but most truly dead. In the middle of the room, sat in a pentagram of blood and burning wax, knelt a robed figure, an upside-down cross looming above him in mockery of Christ. Stood by his side was Jane, who, unlike the rest, was seemingly unafflicted by time or decay. She was perfect, as the first time that Jacob had seen her all those many years ago. Welcome to our little mass, Mr. Masterson, the man on the floor tittered. We've been awaiting your arrival with eager anticipation for quite some time.
What have you done here?
Jacob gasped. Who, me? The man said mockingly. Just a little reaping of souls, both dead and alive, he chuckled. You could say I am about my master's business, Jacob. See, the end is coming, and hell needs its army. I'm just buffering the numbers, you might say.
The dead have no souls. All you have here is meat,
Jacob growled, his hand falling towards his revolvers. His wife, Jane, saw the move and stepped in front of the hooded figure. You're quite wrong, you know, the man said. With my power and little help from the dark arts, I can wrench these souls from heaven itself. Put them back into their own rotting meat sacks. I can actually hear them screaming in here, he said, tapping at his own forehead. Hear them screaming as their bodies rot all about them. Then all I have to do is sacrifice them to the Dark Lord, and down they go. One less soul, one less body for Gabriel to use against us when he blows his trumpet on the day of judgment. And that day's coming sooner than you may think, Jacob. A man is coming, a servant of my master, coming to end it all, to end everything. You, of course, are not much of a threat. But your descendants, well, I've been told that's quite a different story, and so, you see, you have to die. I'm sorry, he laughed. Jane, if you would be so good as to bring Mr. Masterson into the fold.
Vile necromancer!
Jacob spat, but he was backing up now as Jane approached him, a sly smile upon her face. Haven't you missed me, Jacob? She crooned. You've been alone for so long. Come to me, my love. She reached for him, but Jacob circled her, staying at arm's length. "There is no God, Jacob," she grinned at him. "No divine mission? You went mad, my love, stricken with grief and loneliness. You've slain so many innocent people, seeing monsters that were never real." Jacob continued to retreat until his back came against something hard. He spared a quick glance behind him. It was a chopping block, a rusted axe buried deep within.
"Jane?"
Jacob said, fumbling behind him and freeing the axe.
"I know you're in there, trapped in this thing."
The creature stopped and hissed at him as if scolded.
"I want you to know that I love you, Jane. I always have, and that's why I have to do what I'm gonna do. I won't let him make a sacrifice of you. I won't let your soul be condemned to eternal hellfire."
He was walking towards her now. She smiled as he came on, pulling a large kitchen knife from between the folds of her dress. "Yes, come to me, Jacob. Hold me like you once did." Suddenly she lunged at him, her face a rigor of hate, but Jacob dodged her clumsy attack, easily ducking under a swinging arm. Coming up behind her, he swung the axe in a whistling arc, her neck splitting open in a welter of blood, spraying Jacob's snarling face. He hacked at her, the blade falling over and over again until at last her head flew free. The rest of the dead were swarming from the church now, but Jacob, beyond caring and berserk with grief and rage, waded into them, hacking at them, cutting them down, not freeing their tearing mouths and gouging fingers, until at last he stood alone, covered in gore, twitching limbs strewn all about him. The necromancer, seeing his doom, turned to flee, but Jacob flung the axe at him, burying it deep in his back. The man went down hard, screaming in pain, his legs flopping uselessly as he tried to crawl away.
"It was I who knew you were in the wilderness," Jacob intoned. "In a land of drought, I brought you forth. Once you'd quenched your thirst, you forgot about me. So like a lion, I'll be on to you. I will fall upon you like a bear robbed of her cubs. I shall tear at your breast, and like a wild animal I'll render you. For all the wicked in the world shall be turned to dross, and their flesh tremble in fear of my judgment."
That said, Jacob reached down and spun the man about, straddling his twisting form.
"Please,"
the man begged, raising his hands in a feeble effort to ward off Jacob, but Jacob slapped them away.
"You wanted hell?"
Jacob grated.
"I'll show you hell."
With a howl of rage, he thrust his thumbs into the other man's terrified eyes, bearing down with all of his might.
"You want hell?"
He was screaming now.
"You tell Lucifer he don't know what hell is compared to my wrath. I'll kill anything he sends, anyone he sends. You tell him, you hear me? You tell him!"
He bellowed, grinding his thumbs deeper, the muscles in his arms standing out in huge knots, the cords of his neck like sprung steel.
"You tell him fucking with Jacob Masterson was the worst mistake he ever made!"
But the man was already dead. Jacob's thumbs lodged deep in his brain.
"You tell him,"
Jacob said, staggering away.
You tell that son of a bitch."
But the world was already tilting as he staggered from the church, crashing to his knees as he sank down into the merciful darkness. He awoke a few days later, back at the makeshift camp, Anna and Sheriff Finley standing over his bed. The sheriff was lucky to be alive. His left ear and 3 fingers of his right hand were all missing. Still, he greeted Jacob with a sunny smile.
"Well, look at that," he grinned. "Lazarus returned to the land of the living." "How did I get here?"
Jacob croaked. "The sheriff brought you in," Anna said, placing a damp cloth upon Jacob's fevered brow.
"I don't know what you did," the sheriff continued. "Whatever it was, it worked. I was in a tight spot, though my goose was well and truly cooked. Then all of a sudden, those things started dropping like flies all around me. Found you outside your old church, dead scattered about you, even your own..."
But there he stopped, looking down at his dusty boots.
"Yeah, I know,"
Jacob sighed.
Jane. Her soul's finally at rest.
Suddenly he started coughing and lay back down, shivering and exhausted. Okay, Anna said, standing, her hands planted firmly upon her hips. You clear out of here now, Finley James, and tell that doctor to drag his ass right here smart.
Yes, ma'am,
the sheriff said, tipping his hat and fleeing the tent.
That is one hell of a woman,
Jacob murmured, a small smile playing across his parched lips, before he spiraled back down into darkness. Anna stayed by Jacob's side day and night through his long recovery, taking care of his every need. Slowly, an affection grew between them. That affection turning to love. No longer did Jacob hear the voice of God whispering to him on the wind, and finally, his restless soul was set at ease. In the following weeks and months, he helped the townsfolk set their town back to rights, and after much convincing, he lay up his pistols and took up the good book once again as the Shawsville preacher. Shortly after, Jacob and Anna were married in the same church Jacob had grown up in as a child. For 2 years they lived in marital bliss, until one day, Anna told Jacob she was expecting. Some few months later, Jacob had the old dream. A dream about a man who was a servant of the devil. In one hand he held a glowing blade. Streams of blood ran like a river from the other, as nation after nation fell before him. Everywhere he walked, he brought death and destruction in his wake. Jacob awoke with a start, covered in cold sweat as he stood by the window smoking, awash in cold moonlight. You're leaving, aren't you? Anna said from behind, a soft hand against his shoulder. Jacob nodded.
Someone coming. I have to stop him, Anna.
He turned to face her.
Not just for you, or the baby,
he said, stroking her rounded stomach gently.
But for everyone. If this evil wins, if it prevails, the whole world will be hellbound. Do you understand?
She nodded, but said nothing. Silent tears streamed down her face as she led him back to bed. They spent the night holding each other, but not saying much. In the morning, Jacob strapped on his pistols, gathered up a Bible that was missing many pages, and rode away. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I just wanted to tell you thank you for watching tonight's video, or listening to tonight's episode of the podcast. And as always, I want to give a very big thank you to everybody who supports me on Patreon. If you scroll down to the description at the very bottom, you'll find a whole bunch of people there. Also, we've included this nice little scrolling thing because the number of people who support me on Patreon has gotten so big that I'm afraid it might actually max out the description. So we've included this here as the little scrolling text on the end screens. So everybody on that scrolling text, everybody I'm about to mention right now and mispronounce all of your names, and everybody who can donate even $1, thank you so much. A very big thank you to Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Stephanie Butler, Reaper61167, Bobby Karman, Tristain, Pelton, Chance Burnett, Diana Kraus, Vicky McQuicky, SamaHigh, CrusaderChocobo, SpookyShel, Atomaurus, Grand Moth the Milky, Big Smoke 369, Captain Scurvy, SaltyIrishPoet, Estebean, Brayden Morris, Nate Kuhl, HorrorFan1212, Hour Minute Second Time, Kyle Resnack, David Martin, Scare-ington the Unkempt, Robert Malcolm, Angela, Spanky, Snoochie Boochie, Seclude, Lupita Galvin, That Creepy Chick, Tyler Fletcher, Merxenum, Red Shadowcat, Xavier the Cheyenne, Demix, Sean Cadieu-baker, 6 Gay Rats in a Trenchcoat, Turtleman, Rob Like Sharp Things, Cryolinian, Xavier Graphius, Lord Life's Best, Goring Tremagacy, Maria Walker, Emily Mitchell, Crazy Kid, Mr. Marcus Blitz, Eka Limchok, Dirt Diver 030, Matt Bach, Voice of Sand, Coffee Zombie, Hidden Tiger, Shelly J, Jeremy H, Psychomel, Nana, Deleted Account, Melted Lake, Tali Sue, William King, Darth Miver, Michael Ortiz, Satanic Aries, Bardo Hawk 764, Lambda M98, Harley, Sashi Suzaku, Cronut 509, Kaylee Ambrose, Suji Campbell, Stricken, Freddy Krueger, Happy Birthday Jason Wilson, Lisa Cottrell, Caspian, Hades Nephew, Tater Chip, Acid System, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Benjamin Welverick, Cryptic Nightmares, Kiwi the Sloth, Fester's Lampshade, Sky Harbor, Nico Kyle, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, and Corey Kenshin. As always, thank you guys so much. because you guys help me do everything that I do here. You guys help pay authors for stories and commission stories and do everything that I can do to make this channel and make this podcast the best it could possibly be. So thank you all for supporting me here. And as always, everyone, sweet dreams.